Well, hello and welcome to the Walk Off, everybody. I'm Scott Belford, and I am very excited for today's episode as this is a special episode where we get to really dive into the AAA team, the Buffalo Bisons, the affiliate for the Toronto Blue Jays, and I'm very lucky to be joined by our guest for today, play-by-play announcer for the Toronto Blue Jays AAA team, Buffalo Bisons, Pat Malacaro. Welcome to the Walk-Off, man. Thanks for taking the time.
Glad we can make this happen, Scott. I always love to chat about the Bisons and the Blue Jays affiliation. So looking forward to this.
Well, I know that I've been bugging you to get you on the show here for the last 3 months here since I've been down to Buffalo, and that's the thing is it's funny. I introduce you as the play-by-play announcer, but the truth is you are so much more than that to this Bison's organization. It's kind of a jack of all trades. I know I've gone through you for all of my media avails and player interviews and stuff like that. You know this org inside and out. So let's start with how this all came about. I know you were talking with me the other day about you're still close with Ben Wagner. You still touch base with him. When he was promoted to the Blue Jays, how did you getting the play-by-play spot come about? Was there a big interview process? Were you kind of being groomed beforehand? How did that play down?
Yeah, I'll take it back even further than 2018. And really for me, I think the story of me becoming the Bison's full-time lead play-by-play broadcaster started almost 20 years before it when I first started for the team in 1999. And my story is so unique. I grew up in Buffalo. I'm born and raised outside of going away for school for a couple of years in college. I've been in Buffalo the whole time. So really just I've worked for the organization more than half of my life at this point. So whether it was working in the clubhouse as a kid, deciding sports was the job I wanted to work in, and finding that play-by-play or broadcasting was the avenue within sports I wanted to work in. It was just staying involved and interning for the team in my college years a couple of times just to get the experience under the broadcaster Jim Rosenhaus, who's with the Cleveland Guardians, who preceded Ben Wagner, just keeping those contacts alive. And, fast forward to 2010, I became friends with Ben just through our clubhouse manager, head of clubhouse operations, Scott Lesher, who I knew from my time in the clubhouse, and just said, hey, if the Bisons ever need someone, I've been working in Batavia for a couple of years, which used to be a short season single A affiliate of the Cardinals. I'd love to send my material along. And a couple days later, I got a text from Ben and said, hey, we have these openings where we need somebody to fill in for a handful of games. We do TV and you can do radio. Duke McGuire, who's my partner, who's been doing broadcast work and working in baseball for over 50 years now. He doesn't travel as much or didn't travel as much back then. Can you go on the road a little bit? So it was that opportunity that I got in 2010 through 2017 and really making it my own. And the opportunities that Ben gave me and the organization gave me, and becoming friends with Ben. You go on the road and you're on the road with the team for 5, 6 days or 7 days back when the way the schedule was set up. And look, you have to coexist some way or another. So me and Ben being basically the same age, same interests, and just became fast friends. And, even to this day, we'll text back and forth. We were trading messages just a couple of days ago on different things to do up in Toronto for a couple of days coming up in the fall. And, how he's doing in Baltimore and his opportunities. So it was all that. And let's remember, Jerry Howarth, his retirement from the broadcast booth was kind of abrupt, and it caught everyone by surprise. And I was not expecting the Bison's play-by-play position to come open in 2018. I was happy with where I was in my spot in the organization, and but when Ben got the opportunity, it felt like such a natural fit. Going through spring training, doing all the games for Sportsnet 590, The Fan, and then eventually getting the job. So yeah, I interviewed, and there were a couple of us that were up for it. There were like the Rich Baseball Operations is the organization that owns the Buffalo Bisons, our parent company, Rich Products. They own 3 teams: Northwest Arkansas and a team in the MLB Draft League, the West Virginia Black Bears. So there are plenty of good broadcasters within our organization to begin with. But yeah, I interviewed for it, and I think my work for the team prior to that, and just the familiarity that everyone had with me, definitely worked in my favor.
That is such a cool story. And I do really relate to that as a stand up comic because it's funny how the industries that we're in, it's so easy to be asked, how do you do that? And I mean, there's always schools or so on and so forth, but really, most of the learning comes from your peers, comes from experience, comes from being in the trenches and having somebody like Ben or you know, somebody you can kind of look to like a mentor, right? Who's maybe been there, done that a few times and can kind of show you the way. That's a really cool it's really cool how that came about. And I love that you are a Buffalo boy, Pat. Like I love that there is those roots there. I know you've been a Bisons fan your whole life, and I know it's interesting as I've started covering the team more this season. I've learned a lot about the history and how deep those those baseball roots go in Buffalo. And so for the Toronto fans listening right now who maybe just aren't up to speed on what a storied franchise Buffalo is, if you can give kind of the Cole's notes of the Bisons in general, because they're over 100 years old.
Yeah, you go back to the 1800s, and that's what makes the story. I'll weave it in with the Blue Jays connection of the Blue Jays playing in Buffalo in 2020 and then again in 21. You go back to the days when the Bison's franchise was primarily a minor league franchise for 100 years, but there were a couple of seasons, whether it was the old National League, the old Federal League, there was Major League Baseball played in Buffalo in the late 1800s, early 1900s, and a lot of players that are in the Hall of Fame. Even some names come up about every once in a while. When Jake Arrieta, I remember in 2016, was throwing no hitter after no hitter, a name like Pud Galvin, you never would hear of normally, was a Bison's pitcher and threw a bunch of no hitters in a season. And Jake Arrieta did something that nobody else besides Pud Galvin ever did. So you think about that in the history of the franchise, right? It's a name like that. Like, how do you remember that name? But it's one of those that is, oh, okay. And then you look up the history of him. And so you go back to those days of the late 1800s, early 1900s, where Major League Baseball was played here in Buffalo. And then fast forward to the late 80s, early 90s, then Pilot Field, it's now Salem Field, was built, and the team moved from what was called the Rock Pile, the old War Memorial Stadium, where the Natural was filmed, and moved into back into downtown. Not that the Rock Pile wasn't in the city of Buffalo, but it wasn't in the downtown proper. So the ballpark moved back downtown. It was built over 20,000 seats. And if you look at the original architectural design, you could actually take the roof of the current ballpark, basically take it off, and all the piping, the wiring is set to go so that you could build a third deck right down over top. So where you sit for games in the press box, where I sit, the club level, that would have essentially been the middle level out of three, and you build a third row on top. The Bisons were trying for expansion.
Yeah.
Eventually, it went to the Rays, the Marlins, the Rockies, the Diamondbacks. Those four franchises end up winning out. But so you think about all that went into the planning, and it's not as if Buffalo just threw a flyer out there and said, we'd love to have a major league team. There was a big talk of expansion. The committees came to Buffalo, saw the presentation. It's funny enough, you can go on YouTube. I think it's still there today. Larry King, who was a friend of the Rich family, who owns our team, he voiced the narration for the expansion video, propping up the city of Buffalo. So, you take all that into account. And then the Blue Jays having to use Buffalo as their home in 2020 without being able to cross the border. And it meant a little bit more than just being able to house the parent club, because of people like me that grew up, hoping that we'd have Major League Baseball. Yeah, I can go back to the old Bisengram, the program, where it would tout how our attendance over 1 million a year, all the way through the mid 90s. There were times where we'd outdraw several big league teams. The Astros at one point, there was talk of them leaving Houston if they didn't get a new ballpark. Could Buffalo hold it? Probably not. Unfortunately, I hate to say this, but like Montreal, the Bisons would outdraw the Expos all the time. They outdraw the Pirates. It's just the facts.
They outdraw the Rays. Yeah.
Right.
I say
exactly.
Move the Rays to Buffalo.
Exactly. So, you talk about all that history, and then you bring it to today where the Bisons, were able to host the Blue Jays in 20, and then so thankful the fans were able to be there in 21. It really meant a little something extra.
Let's dig in to the now, because honestly 2024 has been a really interesting season for this team. I remember I was sitting in the press box last week with Brian Frank of the Herd. And Herd Chronicles, by the way, if you're watching and you need to know more about the Bisons, no better place to go than the Herd Chronicles run by Brian Frank. But and this is not official, Pat, so this number could be wrong because we might have missed a few guys, but we were tallying up every guy who has worn both a Blue Jays jersey and a Bisons jersey this season. And our number was 19. So we counted 19 guys who have played for both of these teams at some point in 2024, which is, let's face it, completely insane. And I'm curious your thoughts on this season, both for the Blue Jays and the Bisons, because I guarantee the vibes of how this has gone down has been very different, very disappointing for the Blue Jays. And yet I can attest to the fact there is an excitement in Buffalo about all of these call ups.
Yeah, and that's the double-edged sword of it is you never want to see your parent club struggle the way the Blue Jays have. And this was a season where Toronto was going to take the next step, not just make the postseason, but build on that. Even if you don't win the division, because you've got someone like Baltimore who has maybe the best young talent of any team in baseball, bar none. And then the
God,
Yankees,
they're annoying, eh? They just keep coming too.
And for organization, we've seen Norfolk for years be the doormat of the International League, and
Yeah.
they just didn't have the prospects. But finally, over the last couple of years, not only getting Jackson Holiday, but Gunnar Henderson, you name the list. Like, right, they're
Yeah.
built to win. And adding Corbin Burns right before the start of the year, you knew the Orioles were going to be tough to take out in terms of the top of the AL East. But as we've seen, all you have to do is get in. And if you just get in and win in the wild card round, the stats show that you're probably going to put up at least a strong fight, if not win, against those division winners that don't play in that first round that get the bye. So if you're the Blue Jays, if you don't win the division, okay, you feel like you're in a good spot because you look at the rotation. And that's the one thing I would say is very encouraging heading into next year. And I hate to, look at next year as we're sitting here at the end of August. There's still plenty of time now to, as we see the Blue Jays, on a winning streak now to make up a lot of that ground and, find a way into the postseason with teams faltering. But that's why you look at Gosman, Barrios, going into the year, Kikuchi starting rotation, Bassett. Those are guys that are workhorses.
Yeah.
Those guys are the reason why you were so healthy last year in starting pitching and you were so good. And they were coming back again this year. Unfortunately for Alek Manoah, made a couple of starts and ended up undergoing elbow surgery, and he'll be out for at least this year and going. We'll see what happens in spring next year. Unfortunately, Ricky Tiedemann, who we expected to go to the big leagues at some point,
Yeah.
at least contribute. Same thing, undergoing Tommy John surgery. Unfortunately for Ricky Tiedemann, was injured in April. Took some time to try and rehab it, came back to the Bisons in July, and then suffered a setback. So you're talking about an injury that'll take him to maybe the middle of next season, if not late into 2025, before he is really back and good to go. So your starting pitching was going to be so good because of your workhorses and the offense. Look, we know Bo Bichette can be top 5 in the league in batting average. We know that. He's proven it. Had a tough go this year. Vladimir Guerrero Jr. didn't have a lot of power numbers at the start of the season. So it's guys like Justin Turner, who you expected to be that guy that has the postseason experience that you were maybe lacking the last couple of years. Maybe he's not going to be a guy that's going to carry your team offensively, but he's just a good role player to have when you're going towards a playoff run. Well, Turner was relied on to be an offensive star in the first month and a half of the season, and he was. Isaiah Kiner-Falefa was a really nice signing this past offseason. Now he's in another organization with the Pirates, but before his injury, he was another one of those guys that was really helping pick up the slack for the other players that were not performing this year. So when you look at the season for the Blue Jays, it's a year time to get back in the race. And I always say you're a 7-game winning streak away from getting back into it. That's exactly where Toronto is right now. After sweeping the doubleheader in Boston and the win last night, you've won 7 in a row and you've gotten yourself right back into the conversation right around 500. That's not to discount this year, but you look forward. The future is bright because now you're getting to see guys like Spencer Horwitz, who is above 330 hitter and a 435 on base percentage in Buffalo for a year and a half. He's getting an opportunity in the big leagues. David Schneider is starting to pick up the pace again for the Blue Jays. You look at Addison Barger now consistently getting playing time. So when you make all those trades and there's going to be openings, Kiermaier goes to the Dodgers. You've got an opening in the outfield. You've plugged some of those holes with other players coming in as well. But when you look at how the Blue Jays have grown the talent here at Buffalo, the Bisons were strong in the first half of the season because of all the players that have gone to the big leagues and are now contributing in one way or the other, having to figure it out. And that's why the Bisons roster from the first couple of times you came down to Buffalo is vastly different than the one that you saw last week. And you're starting to see now guys that came up from Double-A, guy like Alan Roden, hitting 370 or 380 in the month of August now. He struggled a little bit in June and early July. and made some adjustments. That's part of the game. And that's where the encouraging sign is, yes, you hate to see those offensive catalysts from the Bisons go up to Toronto in terms of the selfishness of they help the Bisons so much, but they have to go to the Blue Jays. But now you've got other players in Double-A now coming up, and some of those trades also. Jake Bloss, as we record this, is going to start for the Bisons tonight. He's got a bright future. Just drafted a year ago out of Georgetown, and has only made a handful of starts in minor league baseball. He's going to be good. So you look at the pitching as well, and the future is bright here at AAA.
It's always interesting to see the dynamics that happen when a team is a seller. Like, you can never really predict what is going to happen. And it's really interesting to see this core of young guys kind of coming together. And I mean, they played together. I mean, I know Will Wagner and Joey Loperfido is a little different, but even they played together in the AAA system in Houston, right? So it's this group of guys who have something to play for now. Whereas I really do think that this team that was so laden with veteran players, and they felt the pressure that was put on them in April, and they kind of buckled under it a little bit. It just didn't. I'm always reminded of I don't know if you saw The Replacements. It's just a goofy movie with Keanu Reeves back in the day. But there's a scene where he's talking about what's your worst fear, and his worst fear is quicksand, right? And it's like the more you start to sink, the more you struggle, and the deeper you go. And that's what this season kind of felt like for the Blue Jays. And now that this has been lifted off their shoulders, these kids, all they need to do is just prove that they belong there for next season. Like, that's the only thing these kids are playing for, and it's really working out for them. And I know you touched on it a little bit, Spencer Horwitz. There's a long laundry list of guys. I'm curious your thoughts on the most likely dudes, and I think Horwitz is probably one of them, but the most likely guys that we're going to see as mainstays with this Blue Jays team come 2025.
Yeah, I think it starts with Spencer Horwitz, and I think it starts with Addison Barger. I mean,
Yeah.
For Barger, this was a big season. I think that can't be understated. After last year, dealing with the elbow injury that he had early in the season, and he just never quite got going in the first half of the year. You go back to the end of 22, and he burst onto the scene. There were so many players that came to Buffalo at the end of that 22 season. Barger led the list of guys that just came up and electrified in a short span. And that's the thing with the staggered end times of the minor league seasons. Dunedin will end September 8th, New Hampshire a week later, the Bisons a week after that. You get to elevate some players to other levels if there's call-ups and you maybe want to get a look at somebody. You can do a little roster maneuvering, right, with the 28-man roster at AAA. So you got to see that out of Barger, and he made a big splash with a couple of big home runs at end of 22, and he was a top prospect. And last year, first game of the season, first couple of games of the year, I can't remember which one it was, but hit a 430-foot home run to Scranton Wilkes-Barre. Like, all right, this is the guy we saw at the end of last season. He's going to be a dynamo. He's going to star on the left side of the infield. His arm from third base is almost otherworldly. It's as strong as anybody's in the game. And that's why he in the second half of the year, after he struggled, he went to right field, and he's so athletic and so natural defensively that he acclimated right away. And I always go back to a play he made in Syracuse. It was one of his first ever games in right field in the outfield, and he robbed a home run over by the Bison's bullpen. That is not easy to do for a guy who never played right field, but he was able to track the ball well. You see guys run into the wall because they don't know the natural positioning defensively, but for Barger, it came natural. So whether it's in right field, whether it's at third base, or there could be an opening, I think Addison Barger is one of those guys that as long as he gets consistent playing time over these final month and a half of the regular season, 5 weeks of the regular season in the big leagues, you're going to see him build that consistency and that confidence that he'll need to carry into spring next year. And, this is the guy that maybe he wasn't one of the highest draft picks and maybe not one of the highest prospects 3 years ago, but he put himself on the radar, and we're seeing really why again this year.
Sure is interesting, Pat, how quick things can change, because only 18 months ago, the biggest concern within this Blue Jays organization was a lack of lefty bats. And now it just feels like every guy coming up is a lefty bat. I know that they've got a couple pushing right now in Will Robertson and Jonathan Clase. Can you maybe touch on both of those two guys a little bit, as you have definitely seen those two guys more than the rest of us have? Jonathan Clase, newly acquired after moving Jimmy Garcia at the deadline. And then, of course, Will Robertson has just been a mainstay within this organization for years and has just kind of put it together over the last couple years.
Yeah, and for Will Robertson, look, here's a guy who went to the fall league last year, and that's an opportunity for players to show off their abilities. He's still very young, but when you talk about whether it's acquisitions or other outfielders, guys like Stuart Burrow, he brings a different skill set than Will
Yes.
Robertson. I don't like to compare players a lot, but you talk about Burrow and now going to the big leagues, and you've got different needs and different situations. Burrow brings more of a speed aspect that is
Yes.
so valuable, especially late in games and in the postseason. But for Will Robertson, I think his biggest strength is not only he's just very strong, but he can go to the opposite field. He's not a dead pull hitter. And I haven't been to New Hampshire myself, but I've talked to plenty of broadcasters over the years, including our friends down in New Hampshire, who have talked to Lee Home Run Park. Will is proving that doesn't matter. And Buffalo is not left-handed homer friendly in terms of the ball carrying to right field. Is it carries better than it did back when the ballpark opened in 1988, when basically you had to hit the ball what felt like 450 feet to get it over the wall 325. But I mean, it's like if you were hitting a wall, you had to hit it through a wall to go out of right field. But Robertson has found a way to go to the opposite field, and he can pepper left center field, has a couple of grand slams on the year. So I think for Will Robertson, again, just that consistency, it might take a little longer because he's not a 40-man roster guy.
Yeah.
So he was drafted pre-COVID. So you're talking about guys that have been in the organization for now 4 or 5 years. But you get a good look at Will Robertson this year, and you say there's something there. There really is.
Yeah.
And coming back to AAA in Buffalo next year is not the worst thing in the world if he just continues to play consistently and steady as he does. Again, he's strong. So his arm in right field, where you need the strongest arm, is good and it's accurate. So he checks all the boxes. He may not be flashy. He may not wow you. But again, a guy, some guys that don't do that are just the guys that you need, just to be consistent. And everyone has a role on the team. That's another thing I think, and not that people take for granted, but I think one thing that when you look 1 through 9 in a batting order, and in defensively, does everybody fill a certain need or a certain role? And I think Will Roberts could fill a role that you don't have to worry about him out there. He's not a liability, and that's not a knock against anyone else. But I think that's his biggest attribute. And you add on the fact that can he hit you 20 home runs here at AAA this year? Yeah, then can that power translate in the big leagues? I think for the most part it could. So that helps. And for Jonathan Clase, the most interesting part to me was he's the dual threat, where he is fast in the outfield. He gets good instincts. He can run the bases really well, but he's added a little bit of power. And I don't want to discount the numbers in the PCL. I know the ball flies out in the other coast, but to have double-digit home runs for a guy who's in center field and a switch hitter, not the biggest guy in the world. He's bigger than maybe your typical. He's bigger than Stuart Burrow, who's a speedster. But Clase is a little bit bigger in terms of body size. He adds that little dimension that can separate him from others. So I think you will see. We're a couple of days away from the September call-ups, where you're going to call up one pitcher and one position player. Each team can add 2 players. So whether it's Clase or somebody else that's on the 40-man roster, or that's the fun time of year is if the Blue Jays. I haven't looked recently, but a lot of this season they've had openings on the 40-man roster for the ability to add somebody when they needed to. You look back over the last couple of years, some of the names no longer in the organization. Brian Baker, who was acquired in a trade from the Rockies a couple of years ago. Those are the great stories of guys that earn it at AAA and get that first call up in September. So not the Clase is that category, but could there be a guy like that maybe on the pitching staff side of things that earns that call up for just being a good organizational player and team player the last couple of years, and you get that little reward?
Well, this farm system is interesting because I know that maybe according to Baseball America and some of the folks that are ranking systems around the league, it maybe isn't one of the crown jewels of Major League Baseball. However, that said, it is interesting how many 25, 26, 27-year-old guys that have sort of put it together over the last year that we're seeing in this organization. I mean, Spencer Horowitz is a good example of that. Stuart Baroa is a good example of that. Will Robertson is a good example of that. So that's one interesting aspect with Jonathan Clase, is that everything that you just said about him also comes with the caveat 22 years old.
Yeah, and you want to talk about like the top 100 prospects, and this is not to take anything away from any of the rating services because I put a lot of stock into them. But just because you're a top prospect doesn't mean you're going to pan out in the big league. So I think that's one
Just
thing
ask
you're
Nate
kind of noticing
Pearson.
here.
No offense. Yeah.
You're right. You're a top prospect, and then for whatever reason it doesn't work out, and the prospect status goes away. But I do think the Blue Jays organizationally, when you talk about Class A or even someone like Will Wagner, Jake Bloss, that those are players that the Blue Jays noticed the need. They needed to go out and get some prospects in terms of guys that you can have here at AAA. If you're going to graduate the Spencer Horowitzes of the organization to the major leagues, well, you need to have players that are ready. And yes, I think Alan Roden in the outfield has filled that role. Josh Kasevich has come up for about a month now and hit over 300 from Double-A, where he was the first one to get to 100 hits in the Eastern League this year. So he's got a bright future and still very young. But you also do need some AAA guys that are prospect status that can come in and help your organization and just be that reinforcements. The reinforcements we talked about with the trades this year, well, there's going to be openings next year because the roster never is always the same. So I think for Class A, that's an opportunity, potentially in the final month of the year, get some starts in the big leagues if he's one of the call-ups. And, just show that, what he did with Seattle, he was, like you said, 22 years old. There's still a lot of room to grow. There's still a lot of room for maturity. And I don't mean that in a bad sense. I just mean
Yeah.
in the terms of baseball sense of learning from players. I think we hear that word a lot. Like, well, what do you mean by that? Why are you talking about mature? Like, are they not there? Well, you're 22 years old. You
Yeah.
still have a lot to learn. There's a big difference from 22
In
to
life.
25 to
Forget
26.
about
And so,
baseball. Just in life,
right.
right?
Right. It has that negative connotation, but I do look at it in the opposite spectrum of, the ability to learn from other guys on the team. And, like having the ability to learn from a guy like Devon White here in Buffalo, who he was in Buffalo last week. Like that allows you that maturity, that aspect of, okay, maybe there's a play that I mishandled, but Devo, who is one of the greatest Blue Jay outfielders of all time, what did you see on that play? How can I learn from that? So I think, at 22, there's still a lot of room to grow. Even the biggest, brightest prospects in the game still have a lot to learn. So I don't want to look at it as a negative way, but I do think I think that's a big positive in his favor.
Pat, I could talk baseball with you all day long. Obviously, we don't have that kind of time. So before I let you go, let's talk really quick about these September call-ups. I know we've kind of touched on some of the position players that we might see get the call, but curious your thoughts on the pitching side of the game, because there are some holes in this bullpen that could be filled. I know Hagen Danner's a guy who is now off the injured list and is on the 40-man roster. Jake Bloss is another guy. Could you kind of go through some of the possible pitcher call-ups and just where you're at on a guy like Jake Bloss and Hagen Danner?
Yeah, for Bloss specifically, he'll make another start tonight for the Bisons as we record this. And he's now, he's far enough removed from a little bit of a shoulder issue. That was what kept him from pitching over the final week and a half before being traded by the Astros to the Blue Jays. And you wonder, like, he hasn't thrown a lot this year. Why? Well, a lot of it was circumstance, but some of it was dealing with a little bit of a nagging issue. And I think just building up and getting the reps in, getting the innings in, getting up the pitch count to around 90. It's something he's even talked about, that he had a conversation with the Blue Jay front office right after the acquisition. Build your arm up, build up your strength, and we'll see where things are at. But you probably see him for a start or two in September. I don't think that's out of the question, and probably part of the plan. Without knowing it specifically, I wouldn't be surprised if Bloss starts once or twice, or at least is a long guy to get a little bit of experience in the big leagues this September in whatever respect. I mentioned Hagen Danner picked up a save a couple of games ago. Dealt with a hand injury for about a 2-month period. He was pitching right before the injury. He was pitching about his best of the season. Had one really bad outing in Lehigh Valley and then suffered the injury. And then now he's come back and he was throwing 96, 97 again. So any issues of the fractured hand, those have gone away. So I think you could see him as an option in September. He's already on the 40-man, having made his debut last year. And, that's part of this too. Is you think about the story of Hagen Danner and throwing less than an inning last year and dealing with the
Ugh.
oblique injury. You'd like to see him go back to the big leagues because you know what he fought through after getting that call last year and suffering the injury against the Cubs. Guys that are not on the 40-man roster right now, I think it's fair to say, a guy like Hayden Yinger, who has been in Buffalo now for parts of 3 seasons and has made nearly 120 appearances for the team. He was
Which
a
is wild.
2021 draft pick. It is, and he's not even the most. So we'll talk about that guy in a second. But for Yinger, he's a fastball, sinker cutter guy, sinker slider cutter guy, and he throws hard. The stuff is there. He's cut down on the walks this year, which was one of his goals. So I think you look at guys that are not on the 40-man roster from the right side. Yinger could be a relief option. I know Mason Fluharty is in just his second year in professional ball. A former college teammate of Will Wagner's, knows him really well. And for Fluharty, maybe going some of those through those late season struggles that everyone deals with early on in their
Lefty
career.
too.
Right, he's a lefty. He's a lot like, I'll compare him to Brandon Iser. Well, I'll mention in a second, but he hides the ball well. That crossfire action as he gets full extension from the left side. The sweeping slider cuts across the plate. And we talk about an organization that values the sweeper so much. That's the type of sweeping slider that gets outs. The fastball is in the upper 80s, but it plays up because of the how he sets guys up with that sweeper. So whether Mason Fluharty's an option this year or not, I don't know, but he's a name to know for the future. And then Brandon Iser, who set the Bisons modern era record for games pitched. He's pitched in 139 games now for the team. He was the 27th man for the Blue Jays earlier this week. And you talk about just great guys that you were happy for their first call up in late June when his name was called. I think everybody in the team was super excited for him. He's been up and down a couple of different times now. So, for Iser, I think he's easily a September option for the Blue Jays. And when you talk about just an added bullpen depth, and again, he and Fluharty are similar. Iser maybe throws a little bit harder and doesn't necessarily rely on the sweeper and the breaking stuff as much because his fastball can sit at 90, sometimes 91. But his stuff has been very good here at AAA. And for somebody who just even keeled, doesn't matter if he's had a good outing or a bad one. You never know which Brandon Isert's on the mound because he doesn't let you know. He's got that poker face always out there. So he could be an option as well.
We are with Pat Malacaro, play-by-play announcer and jack of all trades for the Buffalo Bisons. Pat, thank you so much for taking the time to talk some Bisons and Blue Jays baseball with us. Honestly, I always enjoy whenever we get to have some conversations, and I always enjoy seeing you. And I'm hoping I can get down to Buffalo one more time here before the season ends. And if not, I will be bugging you over the off season to come back on the show.
Sounds great, Scott. This half hour went by really fast and looking forward to chat anytime.